pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar today. Our institute is not an old institute at all, it's a new institute. As we started last year, you know what happened. So we had a couple of events. Darshana, I remember speaking at one of them also. But then we ran out of steam more to say because we had so many other things starting things. Now that we feel we can really begin, so glad to begin with today's session. Today we have three young, strong scholars. I'm not saying the word young so much as strong scholars who are speaking on different aspects of it. Looking at India, of course. I mean, makes a lot of sense for us to be looking at India, but then looking at India really going forward. Now, these are changing times, but then change always happens. But these times are unusual in the sense that everything that we held for certain is more or less questioned now. So that does pose a lot of problems to policymakers on how to react to it, and therefore scope for misunderstanding and scope also for really picking up and being quick on the uptake. People feel upset with changes, the people criticize things, why are you doing this, don't do that, don't get into this camp. All that is going on. Pushbacks will be there everywhere, but I think it's time for us to start seriously looking at these issues. We have, this is the first of the series of events we'll be doing. In fact, we'll be doing one talk every 2 weeks, because since we are an Institute of Policy Research and International Studies, so every 2 weeks we have international relations, and every 2 weeks we do policy research. Initially, we are beginning with economic governance, but then spreading out to other subjects also. So every Friday, we want to slot it out as for us. And hopefully, we'll get some contributions from our speakers and from others and from our own internal people. And hopefully, soon we'll be able to show that we are producing work. Basically, why is it? Okay, let me spend just 30 seconds. The idea of locating it in Baroda was that most policy thinking in India, not just international studies, most policy thinking in India operates out of Delhi, a little bit out of Bangalore, Chennai, Mumbai, Calcutta earlier on, but lesser and lesser so. And the need to get different points of view is also very important. So we will be later focusing a lot on issues of importance to Western India, migration, out-migration as an example, and other economic issues, security issues, coastal environmental issues, all kinds of things. We'll be building on that. This is just by way of introduction. It's not really relevant to today's talk, but I thought I'll mention it to you. So today our three speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Tanvi Madan. She's the senior fellow at Brookings, Washington. She's the director of the India program. And she's also involved in their studies on international order and the changes happening there. Her book, she writes a lot. A book on the Fateful Triangle, basically how China shaped the India-US relationship. She's working on it further. A new book again on the triangle and how India balanced China and the United States over 40-year period, 1980. We'll all be looking forward to that book. But before that, let me request Tanvi to kick off our event today. Thank you, Tanvi. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Director Sinha, and to Dr. Dholake as well. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and thank you to the Vajpayee Institute for hosting this. Shakti asked me to talk about how the US is seeing the India relationship right now. I want to flip this around though and start with where the US has traditionally fit into the US has fit into Indian strategy. Broadly, I think you've seen the last few Indian governments see the US as a critical partner in achieving their objectives. And just briefly, I would say those objectives being at least security, prosperity, and status, or a role on the world stage. And if you read Director Sinha's book, you see this in the Vajpayee government as well, but you've seen it in the Singh government and the Modi governments as well. Beyond kind of this broader kind of how the US is useful to India in meeting its own objectives, I think Prime Minister Modi has called it an indispensable partner. You also see for Indian governments the regional utility of the US relationship, particularly as China has been seen increasingly as a challenge, I would say increasingly since 2008, and particularly in the last few years. In that context, Delhi has seen Washington as useful in at least three ways. One, as India engaged China, in some ways the US relationship gave India leverage. Beijing was more interested in Delhi because Washington was. And so it did give India some leverage in that sense with China. Second is what we would call internal balancing, which is the US has helped India build its own capabilities, whether economic, whether military, whether technology, whether even intelligence in recent years. The third aspect where the US has been useful to India vis-a-vis China is what in academia we'd call external balancing, which is India having developed a network of partners, a diversification strategy, where kind of India has a multiplicity of partners. The US has been a crucial partner in this regard in helping balance China, particularly in the region. And so you've seen in both those domains, whether kind of in terms of India's domestic objectives or regional objectives, but also global, this has broadly been the US usefulness to India. But I think if you look at the last year and a half in particular, this time period, and in terms of kind of both the crisis aspect of it and broader Indian strategy, these last year and a half have only reinforced the utility and highlighted the utility of the US relationship for India. In the crisis sense, both in the way that the US has been useful for India in terms of whether it is diplomatic support during the boundary crisis, rhetorical support, the fast tracking of certain defense equipment, intelligence sharing, and in helping coordinate certain kind of activities with partners as well. I think you've also seen it in terms of the US usefulness in terms of COVID. And I'll come back to that, but in the more kind of immediate, if you think about the recent surge, you have seen, there are various estimates, but almost $500 million of assistance going from the US to India in terms of government, NGOs, diaspora sending assistance in that regard. So the US has been useful in a crisis sense in terms of the pandemic as well as the boundary crisis. I would say in strategic terms over this last year and a half, again, you've seen the US do a few things, or not actively necessarily, but it's helped achieve India's goals in the Indo-Pacific to some extent. It is going to be crucial in that regard. And the fact that you're going to see a constrained resource environment due to COVID means that the US and other partners become even more important in ensuring a favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, which, as Indian governments have made clear, for India, what this means is they do not want to see a unipolar Asia. They want to see a multipolar Asia. So while this is not said explicitly, essentially an Asia not dominated by China alone. I think the other thing that the US and other external partners help India with is mitigating the capabilities gap between India and China. Important to remember that 30 years ago, India and China had economies about the same size. Today, China's economy is 5 times that of India. The US also, and US companies, US economic engagement, technology engagement, helps in mitigate some of India's economic and technology vulnerabilities. But it also has helped India position itself as an alternative for countries and companies looking for a non-China option. And you see this in, I'll give you an economic example that just came up in the last couple of days. A year ago when India was imposing some restrictions on Chinese capital going into the technology sector, there were some people who said, the Indian tech sector would be doomed, especially the kind of startup sector. And what you've seen is kind of record-breaking capital inflows, a lot of that foreign capital going from the US to India. I think you've also seen the US be what you could call a force multiplier in not just the broader region, so kind of Southeast Asia and beyond in the Indian Ocean region, but even in India's neighborhood where traditionally India was skeptical of external powers or engaging with them, or not even welcoming, and in fact, trying to get them not to engage too much in the region. And I think you've seen this both in terms of continued US engagement, for example, with the Maldives, the Undersecretary of Defense engaged with his counterpart. But you also see how this can help India as it faces resource constraints in terms of commitments to the neighborhood. So the US, for example, stepping in to help Nepal out as it has been dealing with the COVID crisis, and when normally it would have been India taking on that role, but unable to do so because of India's own crisis. So I think in that way, the health and economic consequences of the COVID crisis for India is only going to put more demands on India's resources and make the necessity of this partnership with the US, but also with other like-minded partners, even more important. So just flipping that now to talk about kind of how the Biden administration in turn then sees India. And so if you look at the first 5 months of the Biden administration, you have seen perhaps more activity vis-a-vis India, perhaps than any prior American administration has spent in its first few months in office. And I think there are two reasons for this. One, in terms of broader US strategy, and second, in terms of because due to crises. And these are both related. So I think from the Biden administration strategy sense, it sees as India as relevant to both its functional and its regional priorities. In terms of its functional priorities, I would say those are global public health and climate change. And India is crucial and has been a critical actor and partner for the US in both domains and is relevant to those interests. In the regional domain, and I'm going to say a little bit more about this than I did the functional, and I'm happy to answer questions. The Biden administration has made clear that they see the Indo-Pacific region as a priority. Within that, they see competition with China as here to stay. You've seen Kurt Campbell, the NSC, the National Security Council Indo-Pacific coordinator, talk about an era that has moved from engagement to competition. Secretary of State Blinken has talked about the China-US relationship as being competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial where it must be. And they see, the Biden administration sees this competition with China as not just kind of military, but diplomatic, economic, technology, values, and also having information domains too. And this is an area where they see China perhaps posing a challenge to the US in a way that perhaps no other single country can. You do particularly see the values dimension in the way President Biden himself frames this competition. He repeatedly identifies it as a competition of systems, authoritarian versus democratic. He believes that democracy's reputations have taken a hit due to the handling of the pandemic, but also political polarization. And he thinks it's incumbent on democracies to deliver, to show that they can deliver for themselves, for their own publics, as well as for kind of regional and global goals. And to engage in this broad competition with China in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, you've seen a Biden administration that says it needs to do this from a position of strength. That's the term they use, from a situation or a position of strength. This requires two things: at home, recovery and rebuilding from COVID, and second, and in the political sense as well. And second, shoring up alliances and partnerships. And this is the framing for where India comes from a strategic point of view. Because like previous administrations, previous American administrations, the Biden administration has seen India as a geopolitical counterbalance, an economic alternative, and a democratic contrast to China. And this has resulted in the intense interaction you've seen, both bilateral as well as in terms of the quadrilateral that you've seen in these first 5 months. Just briefly, bilaterally, you saw whether it was President-elect Biden and his team's calls to various world leaders, as well as after he came to office, his first few weeks, whether it was President Biden, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, India was amongst the first countries, and particularly came in just after America's allies in Asia as the country that was called. You saw Secretary of Defense Austin visit India following trips to Japan and Korea. You saw former Secretary Kerry, but as climate change envoy visit India. And you have seen just regular engagement at the highest levels, whether that's calls across the kind of waterfront of US-India interaction, whether it's State Department, National Security Advisors, Defense Secretaries, the trade leads. You've seen this on the energy side, and working level cooperation. You've seen regular interaction and quite public, and of course, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar's visit here as well to Washington, and not to mention and his visit again was not just about COVID cooperation, but strategic cooperation as well. And you have seen the US and India coordinate on COVID. I'm just going to briefly just take another couple of minutes to talk about kind of beyond the bilateral, and there has been intense engagement, both because of the strategic importance of India for the US, but also because of the COVID crisis, which has focused the mind here in terms of the India relationship. I think beyond the bilateral, you've also seen the Biden administration double down on the quadrilateral, the Australia, India, Japan, US Quad, and indeed elevate it. It's part of their embrace of this idea of like-minded coalitions that bring together some allies, but also find a way to bring like-minded partners in. So you saw Quad Ministerial, the Leader Summit, you've seen meetings of the working groups on climate change, on technology, and on the vaccine initiative that they announced. But you've also seen the Quad Plus collaboration continue, whether it is a Quad Plus exercise, for instance, with France in the Bay of Bengal. You've seen the Indo-Pacific Coordination Call. There is a Quad Plus South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam, talking about COVID response and coordinating on that. And this, I think, is all a reflection on the part of the Biden administration for a desire to deepen relations with India across the board, bilateral, plurilateral, in regional institutions and international institutions. The road ahead is going to mean tackling not just kind of the deepening this cooperation, but I would say just to end, dealing with some of the challenges that continue to exist in the US-India relationship. I think the trade front is particularly, there will need to be some movement on the trade front, because it's not necessarily healthy for a relationship to focus or to rest on one pillar, the defense and security pillar, so much. And so I think there are some differences on the trade side, and particularly the digital trade side, that need to be tackled. I think the role of Russia and where India's partnership with Russia fits in, India sees it as part of the solution to its China problem some ways, and obviously a partner in the defense domain. The US sees it as part of the problem, notwithstanding the upcoming Biden-Putin meeting. I think the values questions, I know it's a sensitive subject, but I'll tell you why it's not going to go away. And I know there's this thing, these are in India's internal affairs, but just like India should care about what happens domestically here, because it will make a difference to foreign policy, I don't think this values question is going to go away for two reasons. Because the fact that India is a democracy is part of India's pitch to the US, that this is what makes India special. And I think second, some of these values issues are bleeding into the economic dimension. As India has been attracting an investment as the non-China, that is what these companies expect. I'll say three more, just very briefly, challenges, and I've probably blown past my time limit anyway. One is historical baggage. I think you've heard American and Indian policymakers say, we've left the hesitations of history behind, but I think you saw this with the freedom of navigation operation earlier this year, but also the initial response in India after the kind of US did not say anything about India's COVID surge for a few days. The questions about US reliability, the skepticism, or at least within certain circles, is still underlying. And so that has to be addressed over time. And the US has to understand these Indian sensitivities as well. So I think that historical baggage will remain. I'll say one thing, given the university's focus on and the center's focus on some of these migration issues, another challenge could potentially be the dynamics between the Indian diaspora in the US and the Indian state. And finally, kind of as the two countries seek to recover from the pandemic and then rebuild, to me, it's not necessarily a challenge, but it is how the countries choose to rebuild. The nature of that rebuilding, I think, will make a difference to what the US and India can do together, particularly in the economic space, where if both the US and India decide that the way to kind of build more resilient economies and societies is through a trusted partner network and diversification, I think you'll see a lot more cooperation. But if both or either country goes the protectionist route, that you have to onshore everything, that everything has to be done at home or most things, then I think you will see greater challenges in the relationship. So I'll stop there, and Shakti, sorry for probably going over my time by a few minutes.
Thank you, Tanvi. Thank you a lot. In fact, as you were speaking and people about baggage, Pandit Nehru's first visit to Baroda as Prime Minister was a 5-week visit to the United States, which included a million plus people in a ticker tape parade in Manhattan, And we remember the 71 task force of the 7th Fleet, but a task force of the 7th Fleet came in 62 also. So there are all kinds of baggage. You should keep that in mind. Actually, the question I had for you, I'll of course ask later on. You partly answered it already, so that has made my life slightly difficult. So let's move on to Dr. Garima Mohan. Garima is fellow at the German Marshall Fund for the United States, based in Berlin, where she does the Asia program and the India portfolio. She's a recent paper I thought was on the EU approach to the Indo-Pacific, something that I think is something very relevant. Because in India, and I think this summit was very good in the sense that for the first time we realized that there is countries in Europe, but there is the EU, and you can possibly work together. Because we prefer the bilateral approach in these matters, but realizing that in Europe, EU is a very big creature is very important. I also see that Garima had done a paper in German. So I presume that her German, you're a PhD, she's a PhD, of course, from Berlin, from the Freie Universität, but to write a paper in German, I think it's very, very impressive. So then let me stop there. Let me ask Garima to please take over and give us your perspective. Over to you.
Thank you, Shakti, sir, for the invitation, and it's an honor to be speaking at the Vajpayee Center. It's also nice to see Europe included in a discussion on India's foreign policy, and I think it's reflective of the changes we've been seeing recently. So let me start with the jumping off point and talk about the Europe-India leaders meeting that you mentioned that took place on May 8th. And in many ways, it is a watershed moment for India-Europe ties, and that's for 3 reasons. First, as you said, it's not just the EU, it included the heads of state of all 27 European countries. It is a historical first for India. It's the first time this format has been offered to an Indian prime minister. And the format itself is very rarely deployed. It has only been used once or twice in the past for US presidents. It was offered to China last year, but with rising tensions in the Europe-China relationship, was reduced and took place as a much smaller format. So in many ways, this is a remarkable moment for Europeans to realize the importance of India, and vice versa, given how in-depth and broad the joint statement from the summit was. Now, this meeting did not happen overnight. At GMF, we did a paper looking at the trends of Indian engagement with Europe. And it's gone in ebbs and flows. The highs, of course, have come under the Vajpayee government, then under Prime Minister Singh with the EU strategic partnership. And then we've been seeing a pattern of engagement that goes beyond London, Paris, Berlin. It has led to an increasing interaction with Brussels in the EU, but also with sub-regions in Europe. For example, the very first Nordic summit with the Nordic countries, the first ever prime ministerial level visit to Portugal, increasing presidential and prime minister and EAM level visits to Central and Eastern European countries. I mean, this doesn't really capture headlines, but Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Serbia, which, by the way, are all playing crucial role in geopolitics, as many of them are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The fact that India has slowly been increasing engagement, so has Japan, by the way, has really flown under the radar. But I think these are very important trends to note. And it has sort of culminated in now India having a strategic partnership on water with the Netherlands, a green strategic partnership with Denmark. And in fact, in 2020, of all the virtual bilateral summits that India had, the largest number were with European countries. Now, this is remarkable for reasons beyond just summitry and the pageantry that comes with summits. It's also perhaps a sign that India is finally developing a nuanced approach to understanding Europe that goes beyond the Cold War divisions of East and West Europe. I think somebody's microphone is on. much better. So I think it shows a nuanced approach of India sort of going beyond the Cold War divisions of East and West Europe, even though MEA is still structured on those lines. But also perhaps a sign that India is finally beginning to see Europe not just through an economic lens, but going beyond that, trying to understand the relevance of Europe, both for developing national capacities and resilience, but also in meeting India's foreign policy goals. Now, of course, this isn't just one-sided. Europe's outreach to India has similarly been increasing since 2016. The period before that saw some particular lows, with the EU-India summit not even taking place for 4 years. But since 2016, we've seen a shift. And I think a lot of people have noticed the crucial 2019 EU paper on China, which characterized China as partner, competitor, rival. What people didn't notice that the same year EU brought out a paper on India, which talked about the importance of India as a pillar in a multipolar Asia that will be crucial for the EU's foreign policy going forward. And then, of course, we saw European member states coming up with their Indo-Pacific strategies, France, Germany, Netherlands, the EU, all of which have an important place for India. We saw the NATO Secretary General coming to the Raisina dialogue and publishing an op-ed asking for more coordination with India. This, of course, I mean, in the Indian strategic circles, we hardly ever hear of NATO, but the fact that NATO is also thinking of India as important, again, no coincidence that NATO also published a 2030 China paper. So I think in many ways, there has been an awakening on both sides, but I do want to really underline that it isn't something new. It has a historical context, and we've seen this build up over time. And I'm happy to talk about why Europe is interested in the Indo-Pacific, why India has been increasing its outreach to Europe, what does it mean? But given that you asked us to talk about post-pandemic foreign policy, I really want to talk about the ways forward and the challenges that we might see. It's great to see the India-Europe partnership really get a momentum and capitalize on it. And in many ways, the path forward has been locked in by the joint statement that came out of this leaders meeting, which has created dialogues on everything from COVID-19 recovery to climate change, maritime security, supply chains, all sorts of dialogues. There's also a certain institutionalization of the partnership with security defense dialogues, the FTA negotiations being shepherded by a high-level political dialogue on trade, and the connectivity partnership. So in many ways, this has been locked in, and these meetings will take place, and the momentum between Europe and India will continue. But I think there are also significant challenges. I think the first one being how India deals with the pandemic, and how quickly are we able to deal with the domestic repercussions? How quickly are we able to vaccinate, deal with economic recovery, also to fulfill the economic promise of India, which, to be frank, undergirds why a number of European countries are interested in working with India, are interested in the partnership. Of course, it's nice to see the FTA negotiations start up, but the tendencies towards sort of self-reliance, which, to be honest, many countries have resorted to, the whole question of supply chain resilience comes from that. However, what does that mean going forward for the Europe-India partnership, the promise of India? I think those questions need to be addressed. That's the first point. The second point is that it is great that we have started developing a nuanced partnership with different European member states, but we still need to see which countries we invest more in. And the India-France partnership has been transformational. It's interesting that the strategic partnerships were signed at the same time: France, Japan, Germany, under Prime Minister Vajpayee. But the trajectories of, say, France and Japan versus Germany has been very interesting. And now with Brexit, Germany is the pivotal, one of the most important countries in the EU. And the India-German partnership has consistently under-delivered. I don't think If there are Germans listening on this call, would be happy to hear that, but it is in fact true. And now as Germany has come up with its Indo-Pacific strategy, Japan, Australia have been much more proactive in reaching out to the country, and India not so much. And we really, I think this leads to a third and a broader point of, it's good to see the momentum with Europe, but is this a conceptual departure for how India sees Europe in its foreign policy? The idea that European partnerships can be useful for developing and boosting India's national power is new, but we've started thinking about it a little bit more. But the question of whether partnerships with Europe can play a role in sort of regional stability, India's goals at the regional and international level, still is underexplored. Other countries have capitalized on Europe having an interest in the Indo-Pacific. We are still, skeptical. We don't know whether having Europe is good, whether it can play a role. And I think it's good to see the shift starting, but these are some questions that we'll have to think about and would impact the trajectory of Europe-India ties going forward. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Garima. Thank you very much. I think you made some very interesting challenges, the three challenges at the end. And I think, I'm not answering anybody or not questioning that fact that I think there seems to be a structural change, and that possibly could be because we want to be close to the United States. It makes that much of a sense to sell it domestically. It should also seen as engaging substantially, not pro forma, engaging with Europe. So that gives you a broader community also, and also that, yes, we are not putting all our eggs in one basket kind of thing. But the word India signing strategic partnerships actually can be a bit of a, sorry to say the word joke. We have a strategic partnership with Rwanda also, So I'm running against Rwanda, but let's be clear, probably Estonia makes more sense in that sense that you mentioned also. So our last speaker, and to use the Indianism, last but not the least. In the United States, of course, last is always the least, but not being for the United States, I'm happy to welcome Darshana Baruah, Associate Fellow at the Carnegie, which is working for a long time, if I can remember, on the Indian Ocean, maritime security. Very detailed paper last year, very, very thought-provoking paper last year on it. She just spent a few years at the Japan Institute of International Affairs and is now off to Washington, D.C., from where she, like Tanvi, has joined us early in the morning. Darshana, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for this opportunity and also for bringing us together. I don't think I've been on a panel with Tanvi and Garima before, even though we've been at the same conferences and events multiple times. So really grateful to the Vajpayee Institute to also talk about this, and thank you to everyone who's joining in. Definitely makes my part a little easy after Garima and Tanvi laying out the bigger questions, and kind of that has, I think for the audience will be helpful to understand how India has been engaging with the US, with Europe, where are the priorities and where are the challenges. And I thought I will speak a little bit more on kind of the region, the Indian Ocean region, since that's also my research area. But really because within the Indo-Pacific, of course, there are two very distinct theaters, which is the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And I think one of the challenges, and this has been discussed before, was really defining Indo-Pacific for each country. What are the geographical delimitations of the Indo-Pacific? And while that has now more or less been defined by any country with a policy or a paper on it, the priority area for each country is different. And even within the Quad, the immediate priority theater is different. For Australia, it's South Pacific, and as the West Pacific, for India in the Indian Ocean.
Can I request everyone to mute the mics, please?
And for India, it is, for US, it's a little bit of, I think, across the Indo-Pacific, but that does not really mean that the challenges or the difference in priorities does not really mean that the Quad is ineffective or kind of the Indo-Pacific partnerships don't matter, but it just, I think it would just mean that some of the differences that even Tanvi talked about and Garima talked about would have to be managed going forward. And I see that difference, or I see at least some new conversations around this in the Indian Ocean region as US, Europe, and other countries have placed India in their own Indo-Pacific policies. somewhere there is a realization, at least in my conversations with Paris or kind of Tokyo, Canberra, and here Washington, is that there is a realization that in order to have a meaningful or a substantial collaboration with India, the Indian Ocean has to figure somewhere in their own approach as well, because that's where India's interests lie. Even within the pandemic, we saw that India's own COVID diplomacy, India did prioritize the Indian Ocean region. The first set of vaccines, the first set of kind of task forces, the first set of aid that was sent out was to the Indian Ocean region. Again, this is not to say that the other parts of the Indo-Pacific are not important, but just to kind of outline that even within the partnership, there are different priority theaters. And for India, it is the Indian Ocean region. So as India engages with other countries, and as we are looking forward, we are moving forward, I think, to more, as we've come across, I think the hesitations, and India is doing more, I think more issue-based collaborations, India would have to work or with other countries on figuring out how to work in the Indian Ocean region, which is also a challenge from India's point of view, because again, I think as Tanvi mentioned, India has been very hesitant about welcoming external powers or bigger powers into the Indian Ocean region. So I think this is going to be somewhere a little bit of a complication on India's part, where India would feel the need, simply because I think Indian Ocean is very big. India also has its own concerns domestically, capacity constraints. At the same time, it needs to compete with China across the Indo-Pacific, which includes the African coast. So there is a realization that India will have to work in partnerships in the region where they actually, where traditionally India has avoided partnerships or coalitions in its immediate theater. And we've already seen some level of conversation in that. When Secretary Austin visited India earlier this year, our Defense Minister Singh talked about how there's a conversation between more seamless engagement between the three commands of the US Navy operating in the Indian Ocean region, and not just Indo-PACOM, who stops at India, but also CENTCOM and AFRICOM, because that's what defines India's area of interest. And Secretary Austin, in his remarks and in his kind of social media engagement, very specifically singled out Western Indian Ocean, saying we have talked about collaborations in the Western Indian Ocean, which is, again, I guess, is signaling that, that is where India's blind spot is, the Western Indian Ocean. That is where India's challenges lie. So if India and US are going to talk about meaningful collaboration, that has to figure in somewhere in the conversation. The other problem that is going to happen as these countries are welcomed into the Indian Ocean region is that the difference in views. India's view and engagement in the Indian Ocean region is going to be very different from Europe's and US's engagement in the Indian Ocean region. So there will be a need to manage the differences. And a very good example of that is Diego Garcia, Mauritius, the issue of Diego Garcia, that despite all of the collaborations that we will see, there will be times where India and its strategic partners in the Indo-Pacific will be voting on the opposite, or will be sitting on the opposite aisles, because I think each side has very significantly different perceptions and engagement in the region. Any changes in the Indian Ocean region impacts India far more. It's more immediate, it's more, I think, important than it would impact Australia, Japan, or say US in the longer run. So there will be these differences, but this is not to say that India does not realize the importance of the base, or India does not realize the importance of US engagement in the region, but it is more perhaps about India's relationship with Mauritius and India's relationship with the region, which will somewhere have to be managed between India and its bigger partners and India and its smaller partners, which would be the island nation and which would be the littorals of the Indian Ocean region. And I think it might be useful to also remember that it's not just differences in India and its bigger, its Western powers, because look at Japan and US. I mean, despite being allies, they both have very different relationship with Iran, to the extent that, in the sense that Japan has a relationship with Iran, and it's a far better relationship than the United States. But I don't think so that casts a shadow over the alliance per se, because this is just goes to say that these are all sovereign nations with their own strategic interests. And despite these bigger partnerships, there'll always be singular point of bilateral relationship, whether it is with India and Russia, whether it's with Japan and Iran, that will maintain and take its own track. But that should not be dismissive of the potential that the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, and the partnerships bring to India in addressing its own own relationship and in addressing its own weaknesses and challenges. I think at some level, perhaps government is managing those differences. Tanvi mentioned the freedom of navigation operation that happened earlier. I saw far more disappointment and anger on Twitter than at the government level, to be honest, because if you look at the statement that came out of MEA, I thought it was a very balanced statement. I thought it was what a sovereign nation would say. And they said, well, we noticed it and we're going to take it up through diplomatic channels. And I'm sure that has been conveyed to Washington. It was not an activity made or done to put India in the spot. It was, again, US also carries out these against Japan, and India and US does this across the region. And the freedom of navigation operation now, because of Twitter, everybody's far more aware of it and links it to the China question. But it has been happening since for a very long time. I mean, if you speak to any Indian Navy officer, they would tell you that the US ships have been transiting through India's EEZ for the longest time, and they are aware of it. And it is something India is aware of the differences. In that, in fact, on UNCLOS, India and China are on the same page than any of its other partners. But I think that is different too in terms of as new powers out of colonial rule that countries emerge. I think they had their own set of rules, and India has this in UNCLOS. So I do think government is managing those differences, and there will be need to manage that differences, and maybe not get so swayed by Twitter, anger and kind of disappointment on this. But going forward, definitely, I think it'll be helpful to understand that India has different sets of priorities and interests in the Indian Ocean region in comparison to its partners. So as much as it is up to European partners and Washington and American partners to understand India's priorities in the region, it is also up to MEA to understand Washington's and Europe's approach and policy in the region. And that is the only way I think you'll be able to work together. And as we move forward in terms of going forward post-pandemic, I think given the capacity constraints, I do see a lot more conversation emerging in the Indian Ocean region, because again, there will be a little bit of a constraint in terms of capacity and capability in the immediate future as India also deals with the domestic situation from the pandemic. So I think Tanvi has talked a lot about this, and I think so has Garima, which is to really focus on issue-based coalitions, to really identify specific issues, and that issue could range from climate change to intelligence sharing to illegal fishing to naval cooperation. So it would depend on what is the issue that is of importance, what is the region that requires that or provides that platform for collaboration. It could be the Eastern Indian Ocean, it could be Pacific, it could be Africa, but then I think that would figure in terms of the priorities. And to be able to do that, I think it'll be important to understand each other's perception of the region, as I think finally the countries are looking or willing, ready to go beyond the rhetoric of the Indo-Pacific and work on specific projects and I think deliverables. I'll stop here and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Darshana. Thank you very much. What I'll do is I'll ask three of you one question each, and I'll also read out Ambassador Mohan Kumar's question so that you can respond jointly. We'll save time with that. And here's very interesting points. And I'll be very specific in my questions. My first, and reverse order for this time. Darshana, my question to you is, and you rightly mentioned potential trouble over, but before that, the follow-up thing, the problem was caused by a statement coming out. Normally, they have done this 17 times in 20 years. They would report it in the Department of Defense annual reports. This time they made it on the spot, yes, we've done this. That people suddenly came through, and in this age of the Twitter university and Twitter world, obviously, But coming on Diego Garcia, and here I think India will have to really make a kind of leap of faith, will probably suit Mauritius and the United States in the sense of accepting the Chagos Archipelago, whichever you pronounce it, as part of Mauritius, which it is, which has been a principal stand, and then encouraging Mauritius and the United States to enter into some kind of relationship. Because you would not want a thing like this, which has serious implications. The people involved, they went to the International Court of Justice, the judgments there. So it can be embarrassing for everybody. And I think there could be possibly a way out of it with our goodwill in that country. I think we should, in fact, to my mind, do you think, is it feasible or not? My question to Garima again is very focused, is on FTA. As you know, the FTA negotiations went on for years and years. and went nowhere. And some of the issues were fairly petty, some are very substantive. I think now data has become a substantive issue, particularly after the Europe legislation. I may be completely wrong, but this is my feeling. Do you possibly think there are some low-hanging fruits or something which would encourage the two sides, EU as a whole and India, to move on? Because trouble with trade negotiations with Europe is, and Mohan Kumar is here, I know, is that, well, EU negotiates as one, but the negotiator has to go back and get 27 ticks. So it does complicate negotiations in that sense. But I think we should move forward. It's time that we saw Europe for what it is. And obviously, India and Germany could not develop security relationship like India and France. France is a massive supplier of defense equipment. France is present in the Indian Ocean, etc. So that is the thing. And my question to Tanvi, partly you've answered it, is the fact that in earlier US administrations, Clinton, Bush 43, it was the president pushing India agenda versus the State Department and others who were status quoist and were uncomfortable with it. By the time Trump came, you saw that it has flipped, and it was the US establishment into the strategic community. It was actually pushing it very hard. So it has changed a lot. People expected Biden to change. People are disappointed. Some of them I know that Biden, far from changing, it's actually strengthening it. We mentioned it in great detail. But the community, academic community outside the strategic world in USA is still, fairly suspicious, not just because of the values issue, because as far as China was concerned, its best ambassadors to the United States was US business and US academia. In this case, business, rightly so, is not yet a fan of India. They were simply too small in their terms. But even the academic community, how does one get over the psychological, constant newspaper articles, this and that? Any little thing gets distorted. It may be small from the Indian American point of view, but India, it really impacts people's minds, think, oh, see, everybody is against us. It's, I know, not true, but it does impact. Do you think there could be some way of going forward, seeing that we are 1/5 the size of China only? But still, I guess this is a constituency that we should be looking at. And Ambassador Mohan Kumar basically asked, is the position of ASEAN of concern to anybody among all the three panelists? It would appear that ASEAN does not share the view of the US when it comes to China. And I would think Indonesia straight away, which is shifting quite substantially. And second, I wish to know the view of the panelists on the proposition I wish to make. Has India exhausted all hedging vis-a-vis China and is in fact understood sufficiently in the United States? Two very substantial questions. Other questions, Mr. Jhanol, Pinkul Jhanol, I'll come to later on. So my three questions and Mr. Mohan Kumar's two questions. Mine are detailed ones, nitty-gritty ones. These are the very substantial, heavyweight ones. But you three are the best to answer it. So reverse order, please.
Okay. No, thank you. Absolutely. I think on the question of Diego Garcia, India should take the lead in conveying to Washington. I think the level of conversation between US and India has been pretty limited on this, and it has actually led to a lot of frustration because Washington has been of the view that why would India not support us? Because if we exit the base, it'll naturally go to China. But there is a far more, I think, complicated conversation on the ground because first, Mauritius has already offered to kind of extend the base. They've said that we don't want the base to go away. They've been on record multiple times. The Prime Minister has been on record multiple times saying that we want the base to stay and Americans should stay there. But both US and India have kind of separated themselves from the conversation, saying it's a conversation between Mauritius and UK. And that is where the problem is going to be. Even if US and India agree that there might be a way around, because there is a way around it, it also has to be London's decision. And I'm not sure where London stands on it. For London, it's a far more bigger conversation than I think it is for the United States, because there are multiple ways to manage this. You can co-share parts of the Chagos Archipelago has 60 islands, out of which Diego Garcia is only one. So that, and it's at the bottom right. So you have about 50% of the waters within the area that actually are not for defense purposes and can be opened up to Mauritius for fishing rights and others if, there is an agreement. And I think India can play a part in it. But again, it will depend on UK. But the other issue with this is also it throws into question the whole narrative of rules-based international order that both London, Washington, and everybody's actually championing, right? Because the UN redrew the maps and the Chagos are now officially part of Mauritius. So if you're talking about a rules-based order where you're saying UN assumes that position, and you are not accepting that, then you're directly also contradicting your own narrative of the rules-based international order. UN has refused to issue stamps. UN has for UN it is very clear, and it's a resolution that had almost unanimous, only 4 countries voted in favor of US and UK. Everybody else either abstained from it or voted in favor of Mauritius. So I think it will draw a series of conversation across the islands where I think China might find a way, and it already is, to say that, you know, the rules-based international order that the Western powers are talking about is that it only applies to me, to China, but not to them, because there was a huge conversation after the PCA ruling in 2016 when China did not abide by it, and everybody came out and kind of condemned China. But here you have US and UK not respecting the UN resolution, and you know, the conversation kind of stood there, although the UN has redrawn the line. So I think there will be problems on the ground in that, and you're right that India should take the lead in this. I'll just quickly say on the ASEAN question, I'll leave the hedging question to Tanvi. The ASEAN, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that ASEAN does have first of all, ASEAN view in itself is a little complicated, but they did come up with the Indo-Pacific, they do have an Indo-Pacific approach, and ASEAN, I think the main argument is then don't make us choose between you and China, because each country has its own bilateral relationship, then in groups of 3s and 4s, they have their relationship. But that's also the conversation with a lot of other smaller nations. And sometimes, in fact, that conversation applies to India, right? Where Sri Lanka or Maldives or Bangladesh might say, don't make me choose between India and Pakistan, or don't make me choose between India and China. So I think that conversation goes to any smaller country and a bigger nation that geographically they're closer to each other. But every nation, whether it's the US, I think whether it's the European nations like France and Germany or India, they've all placed a lot of emphasis on ASEAN, because saying that talking about ASEAN centrality, although nobody knows what that means. But I think it is more toward, it's a nod toward the need for regional framework and the importance of regional framework as you recreate this architecture, which should not be unipolar or bipolar. So ASEAN is really that structure that is still giving you that regional forum, bringing together smaller islands, smaller countries of the region. So I think the support is towards ASEAN and its framework, but maybe not necessarily how ASEAN looks at the issues.
Dr. Mohan.
Thank you. So you asked me one question on the FTA and you snuck in a comment on Germany and the security relationship. I'll try to answer both. On the FTA itself, it's not just that the EU is a difficult negotiating partner because it has to go back to 27. The EU DG trade is very formal and doesn't budge from its conditionalities when it comes to negotiation. India is also similarly not an easy negotiating partner. This meeting has opened negotiations for FTA, investment agreement, geographical indicators. I seem to understand that from the Indian side, the preference would be for a 2-speed agreement, one with the low-hanging fruit, second with the difficult issues. This won't work with the EU. So I think the low-hanging fruit, in fact, is outside of the FTA negotiations. The investment agreement, something that they signed with China, the CAI deal, for example, that could be easier, but there is a now supply chain working group. I think those conversations will be very important. Even without the FTA, the EU is our largest most important economic partner, right? Like even without the FTA, this is working well. The important issue is when India says it wants to attract companies that are European companies that are looking for a China +1 model or to diversify out of China, how are we managing to attract that, right? That conversation, including guarantees, creating a positive investment attraction of these companies, those are more important questions. And I think they will have to be addressed on a different channel. It's nice that there is a political dialogue on trade, which might help move the wheels, but I don't know about the FTA agreement, given our history and their history, how this will move forward. On the question of Germany, my point was not to compare Germany and France, because of course they have very different foreign policies. Given that now Germany is deploying a frigate to the Indo-Pacific, which will make port calls, they've started a 2+2 dialogue with Japan. They are talking about interoperability with the Australian Navy. I think we are losing out on that conversation by not engaging with Germany. This is a timely moment to engage, because a lot of European countries are talking about Indo-Pacific but do not know how to engage. So in a way, it's an opportunity for us to shape their engagement in a way that suits us. On Ambassador Kumar's question on ASEAN, I think the recent survey on ASEAN attitudes ranks the European Union as the most trusted partner, ahead of even Japan and certainly US and China. There are many similarities in which EU and ASEAN countries view US-China competition. Many in Europe also say they do not want to choose sides. The partnership should be based on a positive way of providing alternatives to China rather than confrontation, competition versus confrontation. Those views we hear echoes of that in Europe as well. And therefore, President Biden's visit to Europe, which is happening now and will continue for the next 7 days, will be crucial. And I think Americans will have to do a lot of work in convincing Europeans as well that they have a positive agenda rather than one of confrontation. And I think it sort of mirrors the ASEAN debate in a way.
The difficult questions will be answered whether India has given up all hedging against China, along with other things too. That way.
So I think I'll say something about the kind of academic question. I actually think, and having been in this environment for kind of a decade and a half now, I can tell you the debate about China here has changed, about India, and the discussion about it has become far more sophisticated and understanding, including in academia, where I can tell you that you can find deep expertise on various issues here across the board than you did 15 years ago. There's also this question, and you really started seeing the change in kind of the early mid 2000s, where there was greater interest in India. And you see that kind of, whether usually strategic economic interest then translates to a broader level of interest amongst kind of academia and think tanks, etc. I do think, though, that often what is pointed to is, opinion pieces that people don't agree with. And I would say, don't be thin-skinned about it. There's lots of, if you look at the Indian media and academia, you rarely see a positive piece about the US. Now, the thing is, these are open societies. You're going to have debates. You're going to have disagreements. And part of it is you point each other's kind of flaws out to each other, and hopefully you address them. The others, I actually think I don't think one has to overreact to kind of everything one disagrees with. This is where we say we're fellow democracies, and that's an advantage. And I think this comes with the territory. I do think there's a broader issue about the US and India needing to invest in understanding each other more. And I will say this, since you have a center and university, the US today, as most policymakers would acknowledge, is perhaps in terms of if you're going to look at a first amongst equal partners, it's probably the case. Tell me how many experts on the US there are in India. I mean, who can sit and explain to you what's happening in congressional committees, etc. Who can explain what's happening in the American states. Now, I will say the flip is true. I can find people here who will tell me who has the votes on any parliamentary legislation or what is happening, in Jharkhand in their investment listing. You're not seeing the flip, and I think that's important. Part of that understanding of both sides needs to develop. But you're not going to find me being sympathetic about, because I can tell you I've seen a much more sophisticated understanding, and India actually gets cut a lot of slack. And I would say the interest in India has actually broadened at think tanks here because of the Indo-Pacific framing, even from 6 or 7 years ago. So in fact, some people say, including folks who work on East Asia, that how come India is getting so much attention when the actual, it's not an ally, for example. On the kind of, and I know we're kind of at time, but I do think this question that Dr. Kumar poses is a very interesting one, and worthy of its kind of own event in terms of hedging. I will say two things. One, I do think there's a lot of focus on particularly how the boundary crisis has changed or not changed India's perception of what it's willing of this hedging debate. So there's more interest in it. But I do think, and you do see an acknowledgement that India is taking more decisions, for example, the Quad Leaders Summit, having Australia and Malabar, etc., which shows that India is moving along the trend that has been the case since the mid-2000s, but particularly you've seen in recent years of agreeing to do things with the US and other partners that earlier would have said no to because of concern about China's reaction. But there are still questions about India's kind of willingness in some ways. How far and fast will India go in terms of being willing to balance China? And I think that still exists. So I think sometimes there's still a misunderstanding here. You still hear a lot of India is kind of non-aligned in the old school. I will send you a piece I did, which points out that for India, the choice today is not going to be the same as it was in US-Soviet competition. In that, India did not have an adversary. There were no direct disputes with either. You could play one off against the other. You could do the middle path. Today, that's different. You have on one side, India's primary rival. I will call it adversary because I don't work in a government. But it is. And the other side, you have one of India's foremost partners, and on which India will not align on everything, but it will align, I think, on some key things. I know there were a couple of questions about this, maybe from Ambassador Goel as well. I think this question of, how will others choose in China-India conflicts, and are they hedging? I think you've seen with the US, the administrations here have not hedged on the China-India boundary crisis. They have been quite critical of China, putting it in the broader context of unilateral change of a status quo, which is disapproving of. But I think India needs to ask itself the same question too. India chose not to have alliances, so it cannot assume that countries will take India's side. But what will India do? I'm not saying there's a right answer, but these questions have to be asked. When others are pressured, when Australia faces economic coercion, if there's a Taiwan Strait contingency and the US takes action, when the Europeans are pressured, when kind of, for example, you see, and you can say Xinjiang and Hong Kong are domestic issues, so maybe not that, but there are a range of issues where others have also said, where does India stand on these issues? And that's a question I think every side is going to ask each other. But I do think India, I think my view is India doesn't hedge against China. India hedges against the uncertainty of partners, particularly ones like the US.
Thank you. You've answered Kujha's question. You've answered Ambassador Suresh Goel's question. There's a question from Nandan Trivedi on Israelization of Quad and its consequences and repercussions. Very quickly, the question from Adit Jain, which is addressed to Tanvi. Biden's ambition is committed to Indo-Pak appropriate security platform. Would Quad be an Asian form of NATO, basically? And can you bring in South Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam? Yeah, the last part of your question, Adit has got to answer with Tanvi just now. Before Taiwan crisis happens, and I mean, how does we react? Not only how does USA react, how does India react also? And yes, Devika's point, Devika BS's point on the COVID inquiry about COVID justifies. Do you think that justifies the Chinese attack on Indian borders in the pandemic because of the fact they were vulnerable? Is China executing an expansionist strategy? And I think the answer is yes. China is, I think I agree with Tanvi completely. I don't think that we should hedge in our language. The two countries, India and USA, are not, India's relationship with USA and China are not compatible. You cannot compare them. I mean, USA is not squatting on 50,000 square kilometers of Indian territory. USA has not been slicing. USA has not been given nuclear and missile technologies to Pakistan. And USA has not been stopping India's membership of NSG and UNSC, etc., etc., etc. So I don't think so. And USA has not been trying to provoke your neighbors against you. So I think we should be very clear what was in the past. Yes, you distrusted the US in the past. I think the stage has come today where I don't think so. We have really an option left when you're right facing there. So anyway, these are the points that raised by a few people. Others very good points. if three of you would like to quickly, we're running out of time, but I think we should very quickly address them. And I saw Garima reading the questions very carefully. I saw her reading it very, very carefully. I'm sure Tanvi and Darshana also read it carefully.
I mean, on the Quad questions, I think we have to defer to Tanvi, the Quad queen.
Actually, yeah, most of them in that sense would be for Tanvi and partly for Darshana also. We still don't think of Europe, Garima, I'm sorry. We are still not yet. And I, for one, which is why I brought you in, I was very keen that we understand the centrality of Europe. I mean, how can we think about the world? It is our largest partner. And in a world of rules, I think if somebody is obsessed with rules, it is the Europeans. So I think we should, in that sense, make much greater efforts to engage. But yes, any of these points that are left out, which both of you would like to answer, Tanvi and Darshana.
I'll just quickly say, and in fact, this does bring in Garima and Darshana's AOR's areas of operation too, on the Quad and expansion. This question often comes up, which is, I am not, or kind of the institutionalization. I don't think there should be a Quad headquarters for the sake of it, because you put there's a BRICS headquarters. I'm not sure. Look at what I would like to see what the outcomes are. So to me, the flexibility of the Quad is actually a strength. And if it requires, some organized, to me, the kind of institutionalization doesn't mean an organization. It means things like you have these working groups, and once their work is done, you disband, you move on to something else. You might have Sherpas, one liaison in each place, regular meetings, doing exercise. And it doesn't have to be, yes, you have Malaba perhaps, but opportunistic exercises. So for example, I like that even not just at the Quad level, within the Quad, the bilaterals and trilaterals are continuing, because those form the basis for that Quad cooperation. But you also see, for example, the US sending observers to the Australia-India naval exercise, Japan sending observers to the India-US Air Force exercise. India, for example, I think it's this week or maybe next week, India sending observers to the US-Australia Talisman Sabre exercise. So I think, these are the kind of things where that's the kind of institutionalization I think you should see. In terms of expansion, people have said, I think probably heard me say this before, I think you want the Quad to develop and evolve for now as it is, and engage with other countries constantly. So this is where I think Europe comes in, exercises with France or Canada, for example, as has happened, bringing in, South Korea on, say, a supply chain discussion. In some cases, it might be a US, Australia, Japan conversation that doesn't include India. So I think the whole point is, those of you who play Legos, it's like various building blocks, and then you can add on in different ways. So I think of it as a plug and play format. You will have these different coalitions, but I think the Quad itself should stay that way, because I think these four countries, and the Quad will always move at the pace of its slowest or most reluctant partner. And I think these four countries have reached not a consensus on vision and approach, but convergence, including on how they see China. And I do think it should stay as is for now.
Absolutely. Just to add a few sentences to what Tanvi said. I think Darshana had mentioned this thing, that you can have changing alliances kind of thing, or a variable geometry depending on the problem. You're dealing with climate change, you deal with somebody. If you're dealing with something else, you're dealing with somebody else. If you're dealing with piracy in the Malacca Straits, obviously some countries are more interested than the others. So I think you don't have to have a membership kind of a thing. It's not a club with members, but this is a platform, more like a platform. So therefore, digitizing it, I think, would weaken it in that sense. It's far greater. Some ambiguity is not always a bad thing in diplomacy. We need it. But I think before we wind up, it has been both of you, Darshana, going to add something before I wind up and hand over to Dr. Dholakia?
Yeah.
Please, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on the Quad that I absolutely agree with Tanvi that I don't think so it should be institutionalized in the form of like a headquarters. It definitely makes sense the way it is, and also the hesitation still is from Indian point of view in the sense that I think Japan is very, very, very interested in doing something at a defense level within the Quad framework that is just the four countries. And I think the hesitation is coming from India. And even if you were to go ahead and institutionalize the Quad, and you were to say that, okay, the Quad is going to be this bearer of rules-based international order or whatever, maritime democracies and all of that, and something goes wrong in the South China Sea, I'm not sure India is actually going to show up to it. The other three will still be in some level. I'm not sure how much India would be a part of it. So you're really making way for one incident to kind of, I guess, diminish or take away the efficiency of Quad, because I think, as Tanvi mentioned, Quad has multiple roles that did come out of the tsunami of 2004. So, and the one thing I think a lot of people, we don't tend to draw the parallel is there is a functioning Quad in South Pacific, and they have been functioning and they have been working for decades now, and they work on a lot of non-traditional security issues. So I think it'll depend on what other areas. Institutionalizing in the form of a NATO just doesn't make sense at this point.
I will say, Shakti, if I may, if there ever is a Quad headquarters, I hope it is in one of the islands that that Darshana writes about, so all of us can go visit there.
I agree.
Can I come in
please,
quickly
Garima.
on the Europe question?
Please.
So I think it's important to note, like, agreeing with what Tanvi and Darshana said, that Quad should be sort of plug and play and not institutionalized. It has to be noted that all the Quad partners, including India, but maybe to a lesser extent, are very keen on engaging with Europe. Japan, for example, has been doing bilateral maritime exercises, even with the EU format, not just anti-piracy, but more than that, in the Mediterranean as well. The US, of course, is interested in bringing Europe in because they have money and resources to counter, to create a parallel infrastructure initiative. I mean, I see that they've revived Blue Dot, but even in Quad joint statements, they do talk about infrastructure and they're interested in bringing Europe there. France, of course, is keen on pushing the Europeans to engage more in the Indian Ocean bit, I mean, under France's leadership. But even Australia is engaging more and more with Europe. I think we have to understand, even for China, it says all belts and roads lead to Europe. In a way, Europe is going to be a crucial swing state or swing union as US-China competition develops. And Europe is dealing with a lot of the challenges that we are dealing with as well, when it comes to both disinformation, 5G, emerging technologies, everything China related. There are lots of parallels, and it's good to see India realizing the importance of engaging with Europe, not to the extent of other Quad partners, but certainly a lot of people in Europe are interested now in engaging and learning with what is going on with the Quad working groups, particularly vaccine production, etc., and where they can plug in. So I would not be surprised if these conversations also come up going forward.
Absolutely. I mean, people don't know that last year, China ran more than 12,000 trains to Europe with containers. That's a large number. So, I mean, because Europe has not been speaking, even today, when you go to Tehran and you have one chair and two chairs, there are problems in that sense when the outside world perceives Europe. But I think times are changing and will have to change in that sense completely. And Tanvi has very rightly made the point in the comments here, Sultan. No, Quad is not NATO. When you think what is NATO, then as Jaishankar very rightly said, you don't know what the Cold War was. It's completely not NATO. So let's be very clear on that. And I say the founder of Quad, just to add salt to the wound, founder of Quad is not Shinzo Abe. The founder of Quad is Xi Jinping. Let's be very clear. India would never have made these shifts but for China. So I think we should also look at it straight in the eye and not pretend otherwise. Can we do this and do that? No, you would want to do that. But your flexibility is been curtailed, what do you do, right? So we have to have these options. I'll leave it at that. And just before I hand over to Dr. Talakia, we'll be having every second Friday these talks. We're having talks by Harsh Pant down the road, having talks on China by Antara Ghoshal Singh, her really paper I really like. And things like Tanvi rightly mentioned the United States. How many of us work on the Chinese economy? What is the impact of the environment, this thing, on growth in China? I mean, we all talk as Chinese politics, external politics, how does Jiang Zemin exercise influence today in China or not? I mean, there's so much that we need to really study and engage with the world. If you want to rise up and be a great power, Potenza, you could potentially become a great power. I think we really need to widen our horizon and engage much more deeply. So with that, let me hand, and I'll personally thank the three of you, of course, but I'll formally request Dr. Amit Halakia to give us his views and then a quick vote of thanks.
Thank you, Shakti sir. I think I'm reflecting the sentiment of everybody present here when I say that we really had three wonderful presentations on Indian foreign policy and its future trajectory. This is actually a second webinar that we organized on Indian foreign policy in the post-pandemic era. We had one last year when we had just entered the pandemic phase. And there was a certain degree of uncertainty and gloom in the air, a certain lack of clarity. Now, after 1 year, and after listening to these three brilliant presentations, I think we are convinced that probably India's diplomatic bandwidth has broadened and not shrunk during this pandemic period. And there are more choices and more options available today, as Dr. Tanvi mentioned, than possibly a year back or 2 years back. The range of issues that the three presenters discussed is really very wide. I mean, from United States to Europe to Indo-Pacific to Southeast Asia. And we are very happy to note that instead of discussing things in general terms, as most of the Indian scholars tend to do, unfortunately, there was a lot of emphasis on nitty-gritties and micro-level issues. In fact, if we look at all the issues discussed today, it really calls for a book to go in depth into every piece of analysis and every suggestion that was made by the scholarly analysts. So we are indeed very thankful to you. On behalf of MS University of Baroda, on behalf of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute, and on behalf of all of us present today, we convey our very sincere gratitude to each one of you for sparing your valuable time from different time zones, of course. And we do hope that this conversation shall continue. This is the beginning of a policy relevant conversation that we have begun under the guidance and leadership of Sri Shakti Singh. And definitely there will be many more opportunities and different platforms available to us to continue this conversation. I also convey my thanks to all the distinguished personalities who were present in the participants, among the participants today, including some of the former ambassadors and so on. And we value your participation, your questions, your interventions, and also look forward to similar association in future. So once again, let me thank each one of you. And just one lighter point, that there is always a discontent expressed that Indian policy making is dominated by men, mostly. I mean, we had some exceptions in the past, but definitely I think the field of Indian foreign policy analysis looks quite different. And probably looking at and listening to these three brilliant women who made the presentation today, I think women are going to matter more and more when it comes to foreign policy analysis in India. Thank you, one and all, and have a nice day ahead.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, all the speakers. Thank you, audience. Thank you. Be in touch with you guys.